Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, Dad rigged Mum's car to stop a car thieves and Grandpa scares thieves off with a shotgun when they try to reclaim the stolen car. When I posted my story a day or two ago about how my dad helped me get revenge on my school bully, many of you asked me to thank my dad. So I did. He was tickled pink and thanks all of you profusely. I decided to ask him if he had any stories of revenge he got on people personally just for fun. And he shared this story that I figured you guys would like. For some context, Dad grew up in what is now the Rust Belt back when the rust was starting to form, so 50s to 70s. So it was a Wild West scenario, especially in his blue-collar hometown. People were leaving to find better jobs and the big factories were beginning to downsize, shut down. His hometown quickly gained a reputation as a dangerous place to live. This became true after the city didn't have enough money to pay the police force to work 7 days a week. So the police force would work Monday through Friday and had the weekend off. If you're thinking this was leading to a dangerous situation, you are absolutely right. Dad told me stories about how his neighbors would be broken into while said homeowners were home, would steal all of their stuff and then leave because they knew the cops weren't coming. My grandparents were so worried that Grandpa, a Korean vet, went out and bought a couple of shotguns, one of which was a sawed-off shotgun, and made sure he had plenty of ammo for both the shotguns and his service revolver. By this time, Dad had just finished his last year of college, was now married to my mum and living in the state's largest city, about 2 to 3 hours away from his hometown. Mum had wanted a 1960 cherry red Ford Mustang convertible ever since she was a little girl. As a belated wedding present for her, Dad went out, found a broken-down Ford Mustang convertible in a junkyard and fixed up the convertible for her for maybe $200, about $700 today, adjusted for inflation. Mum was so happy when she got the car that I got lucky that night, as Dad put it, and would brag about her husband spoiling her. Anyway, during this time, Dad's youngest sister, Aunt Gertie, had graduated high school, married her high school sweetheart, and moved out to be with her new husband. So Grandma and Grandpa decided now was a good time to get out of town and downsize. They asked my parents to come and help them pack and move, something Dad was happy to do as he would get to see his school friends and hang out with them. Unfortunately, a couple of days before Dad was supposed to go and help, his car broke down and it needed some major repairs. He had to order some parts that would take a while to arrive. They had no choice but to use Mum's car. Mum, and Dad, was nervous about this because that car, while not in mint condition, looked really good and was a prime target for car thieves. Doubly so because my parents would be at least spending the weekend when there'd be no police on duty. However, Dad was a problem solver, and during the drive, came up with his plan to basically make the car retrievable in case of theft. Once my parents arrived in the hometown, Dad's first step was to call up his buddies from school who had all become engineers, welders or mechanics, and ask them for their help. In exchange for some beers and some of my mum's delicious cooking, they agreed to help. Dad also got Grandpa involved as well, just in case. The first thing was to weld a cap on one end of a 8-inch diameter pipe that was about 2.5 feet long. They then filled the tube with white fluorescent paint. Once the pipe was loaded with paint, they soldered the bottom of a tin can to the open end of the pipe. They attached the tube to the undercarriage, right by the trunk. Finally, they punched a nail into the tin closing, tied the nail with a little bit of fishing line and tied the other end of said fishing line to the wheel rim. Here's how it would work: when the unlucky thieves would take off, the wheel would spin, pulling out the nail. Paint would then drip out of the hole made by the nail at a slow pace because the hole was small and the tube loaded with paint. They planned to follow the trail until they found the car and bring it back. Unless you were looking at the undercarriage itself and could see the full apparatus, you wouldn't really see the trap. If you did, unless you're really skilled with cars, you'd think the pipe was part of the car workings. They set the car out at 4:30 p.m. on Friday afternoon. The cops would be off by 6, and waited, everyone taking shifts through the night so as to alert everyone else when the car was taken. Nothing happened Friday night. Saturday came and went with no troubles either. Then, at about 1 a.m. on Sunday night, Mum heard the unmistakable sound of glass breaking and alerted everyone. By the time they got out there, the car was gone, and a long trail of paint was leading them in the right direction. Dad and two of his buddies, let's call them Sam and Tom, got into Sam's car and they went after the Mustang. It was during this, they realized that this might not have been a smart idea. 1. They had gone out without weapons. 2. The paint could easily be smeared by another car passing, creating a false trail. And 3. They had to stay close but not too close, lest the carnappers get suspicious. Fortunately, either the thieves were too cocky or too stupid. Dad believes it was a combination. Dad, Sam and Tom only had to follow the car for 15 or so minutes until it pulled into the driveway of a decent-looking home. Just to be safe, the trio waited maybe 30 minutes until the thieves went inside the house and the lights shut off. The car window was busted, but they could easily replace it, and the thieves had hotwired the car. Tom plugged the hole in the tube to keep paint from leaking out further and creating a trail, and Dad, using his keys, turned on the car and followed Tom and Sam home. Well, apparently the thieves must have heard them leaving, because the next thing Dad, Tom and Sam knew, they were being chased by someone. Since there were no speed traps, Dad and Sam had the pedal to the metal, praying that they would not T-bone someone while running red lights and stop signs and making hairpin turns that almost flipped them over. As I said, this town was the 70s version of the Wild West. By some miracle, all three got back to my grandparents' house without hurting anyone else or themselves, the thieves still hot on their heels. Dad and Sam both honked their horns to alert Grandpa as the thieves pulled up. Well, the two thieves got out of their car and Dad felt his heart race as he saw that at least one of them had a baseball bat and a knife. And here comes Grandpa, holding his sawed-off shotgun at the ready. Here's an important thing to note about Grandpa. He was 6.5 feet tall, 300 pounds of mostly muscle, and has never raised his voice to anyone, especially when he was angry. Now, Grandpa was a big cuddly teddy bear type to us grandkids growing up, but upon your first meeting him, you might not think he was a sweetheart. The car thieves stopped intimidating Dad, Tom and Sam and stared at Grandpa. Their eyes were as big as saucers and their mouths agape. I'm going to give you boys to the count of 3 to get the hell out of here and never come back, Grandpa said in a low, soft and clear voice. Dad winced when he heard Grandpa say that. The few times he ever got smacked by Grandpa was when Grandpa warned him he would count to 3 and Dad didn't listen. Grandpa meant business. Grandpa didn't even get to the count of 2. The thieves jumped back into their car and must have broken the sound barrier due to how fast they were driving. By the middle of the week, my grandparents were all packed up and the car window on the convertible had been repaired, so everyone went home, safe, free, and all had their cars. The next one is titled, Dad Helps My Friend and Me Get Back at Middle School Bully, aka Why You Should Never Anger a Dad Who Happens to Be an Engineer. This week was our middle school reunion. Most of us went to the same K-8 school, ages 6 to 14, for our friends across the pond, and while we all were laughing and talking over Zoom, my friend, whom I'll call Janice, brought up this memory. At our schools, with the exception of kindergarten, 2 grades would be paired together, so 1st and 2nd grades would be taught together, 3rd and 4th would be taught together, so on and so forth. The 7th and 8th grades had to do a special project every year called Toy Team, or TT. Basically, we would be put into teams, build a specific toy that we could market. Representatives from local businesses would be invited to judge our projects and win awards in various categories: best presentation, best design, best research, etc. The idea behind this project was to teach teamwork, ingenuity, creativity, etc. But in the end, it caused more trouble than it was worth, for reasons I'll get to in a moment. I hated TT with a passion. The biggest reason being that the boys would take over the building of the toy and the girls did the secretarial work, listing results, surveying the groups, writing final reports, etc. It wasn't fair, but I was always too afraid to speak my mind and ask to help building, something I've always enjoyed. But 8th grade year was the one that almost broke me because of one kid. Enter Carlos, not his real name. Carlos was in 7th grade but was touted as a math and science genius. He had to go to the local high school to take math, science classes because none of the teachers at our school were qualified to teach at his level. He also prided himself on being a cool kid and had a gang of sycophants follow him around, reaffirming his greatness. In reality, Carlos was a little punk who honestly should have used a lesson or two in the school of hard knocks. He was a jerk to the highest degree, always looked down on everyone else, and since his parents, who were honestly Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy come to life, defended his actions and threatened everyone around them. Because it was a private school and Carlos' parents were big donors, even the teachers were limited in what they could and couldn't do to discipline him. The worst they could do was detention, but he just shrugged it off. Seriously, unless he killed somebody, Carlos was untouchable. Janice and I were thrilled to be in the same group, until we learned we'd be paired with Carlos. Carlos immediately took over the project and bossed Janice and me around. Janice and I were favorite targets for Carlos and his sycophants because we were quiet, kept to ourselves and just focused on our work. Carlos proceeded to make our experience in TT miserable. He claimed that because he was the big math and science expert, only he could build our glider and we had to write it down. Janice and I put up with it at first because we knew our teachers would do nothing and it was just an 8-week-long group project. Then one day, during week 6, it happened. We had to test the gliders. Our testing rigs were set up with yardsticks and rubber bands on tables. You'd load the gliders into the rubber bands, pull them back and launch. Then you'd measure how far they flew and make your corrections. Once again, the boys took over and the girls did the recording. Janice and I were making notes when I noticed the rubber band was about to snap due to how stretched out it was. I warned Carlos about the rubber band and to adjust the glider. When he protested, our teacher, who I'll call Mrs. Adams, snapped at him and told him, "Listen to your partners and adjust." Well, Carlos did as said, but he pulled back the glider back too far and too fast. As a result, the rubber band snapped. The rubber band not only slapped Carlos in the face but broke our glider to pieces because he pulled it back too far and the force hit the fragile wood. Carlos was upset and turned his anger on me. "No wonder you suck at math and science," he said. This, in addition to all the stuff going on, broke me. It's true that math and science were my worst subjects because I have a learning disability that makes those subjects tough. But I've always loved building and repairing things. My dad is an engineer and some of my earliest memories were of him teaching me how to fix my toys and encouraging me to experiment with different building things. In addition, I was a total daddy's girl. I wanted to make him proud and I knew that me being bad at math and science was something that stressed him out. So, I'm not joking, I ran away, like in those cliché 90s movies. My house was 2 blocks away and I ran there. Fortunately, my teachers knew that there weren't many places I could have gone and called my mum, who was a stay-at-home mum, to tell her what happened and to please return me to school. What I didn't know was that Dad was working home that day. When I ran in, crying and upset, he noticed and went after me. He calmed me down and asked what happened. I told him everything. About Carlos taking over. About how Janice and I were doing all the hard work and Carlos being a nasty bully. The rubber band snapping and me getting blamed. Dad was quietly hugging me, kissing my forehead. When Dad is quiet, that usually means he is angry. When I looked up, I saw that his mouth was set in a hard line and his eyes were dark. I was scared he was angry at me. I begged him to not be mad at Janice or me because it wasn't our fault. Dad instead reassured me that he wasn't mad at Janice or me. He was mad at Carlos, and had an idea to teach that little punk a lesson. Dad then called the school, reassured Mrs. Adams that I was okay and that I would spend the rest of the day at home. He also sent an email to not only Mrs. Adams but Janice's parents detailing this plan of his. Janice's parents and Mrs. Adams were game. After we heard it, Janice and I were smiling ear to ear even though we knew we had to put in the work all by ourselves. The next day, Mrs. Adams pulled Carlos, Janice and me aside and said, thanks to the glider incident, Carlos was now on his own and had to finish the project by himself. Janice and I would be doing our own project. Carlos was pretty happy about this because those two slowed me down. However, what Carlos was not thinking about was that since Janice and I were doing all the paperwork, we had all the information. We offered to share our notes with him in an attempt to be fair, but he said, it's all in my head and I don't need it to slow me down. In fact, I bet I can do it even better. We all had to sign a contract that information was not exchanged and witnessed by Mrs. Adams. The next 2 weeks were easily the best of TT for Janice and me. Since we had all of the notes, we were able to rebuild the glider in less than a week. Our dads even set up a makeshift glider range for us to test, and we spent an entire Saturday flying the gliders, one in red, the other in blue, which were the most popular colors according to our surveys. As a result, we improved our glider and even made a game out of it, racing them. When Janice's dad mentioned the red and blue gliders reminded him of the Gemini dueling coaster at Cedar Point, we decided to name the toys after the coaster and make them a 2-for-1. We built the box for our gliders, got our calculations double-checked by not only Mrs. Adams but 2 independent adults as well. Both dads, who were co-workers, signed off on the math, even adding their proof of work and signing the back, this is important for later, a presentation board with an overview and along with a huge binder showing all of our work. Janice and I worked really hard on this project and it felt awesome. On our last day, we had a pizza party and sleepover, making bets on what Carlos' reaction was most likely going to be. Presentation day arrived. This was one of the few days we could wear something else other than our school uniform, so we were dressed in nice outfits to make our presentations. Janice and I stood together with our gliders and had big smiles on our faces. We looked at Carlos, who had an actual nice-looking glider, box, presentation board, paperwork and everything. However, he had an anxious look on his face instead of his usual arrogant and cocky one. Which made me happier. Presentation day worked was like this: the first half of the day would be the representatives walking around and judging who had the best looking gliders, boxes, presentation boards, binders, etc. Then we'd have lunch and come back. The ones who had been selected for the second round would then make their presentations to not only the representatives but the entire class. Janice and I answered the questions asked by the representatives, arrived with confident and clear answers. One of the businesses that attended was the engineering firm that our dads worked for. They were impressed with our presentation and selected us for the second round. Carlos was also selected, and he had a worrisome look on his face when the bell rang. After lunch, we returned, and something about the way the binder was sitting made me double-check. Wouldn't you know it, the pages with double-checked calculations and proof of work were gone. Carlos, being the dick he was, didn't keep notes about his experiments, so he decided to steal our work and present it as his own. Janice and I decided to take a professional approach in order to grind Carlos further into the dirt. I went up to Mrs. Adams and the representatives and asked them if they had gone through our binder when we were gone because the calculations and proof of work pages were missing. Mrs. Adams was immediately suspicious as well, given Carlos' behavior, and immediately walked over, took his binder off the table, flipped through it, and found the corrections page. He had hastily scrawled in his name at the top next to ours so it looked like he was involved. Mrs. Adams looked at him and said, "Carlos, why did you take the pages?" Carlos said, "They gave their work to me, remember?" Fortunately, Janice and I included our copy of the signed contract from earlier saying Carlos had refused use of our information in our binder and pulled it out. At this point, Carlos looked like the kid who denied he had been eating cookies even though he had a ring of crumbs around his lips. Well, they stole my double-checked work. See. He shows the proof of work our dads had done. I took it out and put it back. Then Janice looked at one of the men, who I learned later was the supervisor of the team both of our dads were a part of, and said, "Mr. Lionel, could you please check his proof of work?" Our dads signed the back of ours. Mr. Lionel agreed and flipped the page over. Carlos didn't notice that our dads had signed the back of the proof of work and included their names. Mr. Lionel nodded. "I know those signatures anywhere," he said before looking at Carlos with a glare that could wilt a flower. "You told me you wanted to be an engineer someday, right?" Carlos could only nod, his face white. "You are aware that engineers take theft of others' work seriously?" Again, Carlos nodded. "And that if you were doing this in a professional setting, you'd not only be fired from the company but blackballed from the industry," Mr. Lionel said, staring down at this kid. Carlos looked like a melted snowman and that he wanted to disappear into the ground. I learned later that Mr. Lionel was a nice man, but man, I could immediately see why our dads respected him in that moment. Mr. Lionel turned to Mrs. Adams. I recommend that he be disqualified from the next round and be made to apologize to these two girls in addition to returning the proofs to them. Carlos did return the paper and apologized for the theft, not looking me in the eye. As a result, not only was Carlos disqualified but because he cheated, he flunked the project as a whole. Since TT was at least 30% of our science grade, he ended up getting his first D on his report card, which his parents had a freaking field day with until Mr. Lionel sent them a letter telling them what their son had done and that if he didn't shape up, he risked real trouble in his professional life. Janice and I ultimately won Best Design, but the best award was seeing Carlos' ego get knocked down several pegs. He was still a jerk, but was scared of us. Hey, I might be bad at math and science, but at least I know not to be mean to people who might help me someday. The last one is titled, Boss Fired Me for Checking on the Development of My Baby. So I deleted his business website. I'm a 21Y male and I worked for a small business let's call David's Antiques. I worked for Mr. David for about a month with one other co-worker we'll call Stan. Stan was nice but had a few issues with his physical health but was overall a really great guy. And from what I've been told, Mr. David was stubborn, arrogant and quick to anger. One Friday morning I texted my co-worker that I was going to the hospital for a checkup of my baby's development since my fiancé has been getting very stressed. We live with her grandfather and he's a right big hole, and yes, the baby is developing fine. My fiancé was just getting low on vital vitamins. About 30 minutes later I get a text from Stan saying Mr. David is concerned I was not dependable and fired me on the spot. One thing to note is that while I was working I helped him set up a very nice Wix website and put products on it using a very nice Sony camera my fiancée had gotten from her father right before he died. I helped Stan take pictures of over 70 items to put on the shop when I was fired. I was so upset that I didn't feel nothing but anger, and I wasn't satisfied with just letting it go. I changed his Google Maps profile to David's Antiques Ripoff Emporium. My fiancé told me to stop being petty, but I had rage in my eyes and I wasn't gonna stop till I felt satisfied. A few weeks after I realized that I was still logged into his Gmail account. So I logged onto his Wix account and changed the password. They had changed it and I had forgotten the new password, so I made a new one and then proceeded to delete everything. His domain? Gone. The website? Gone. And now I'm typing this at 3 AM all the while smoking a cigarette and laughing my butt off. I'll post an edit if I hear from them. Thanks for listening.